Jug life. All right. Is that my boy Nick Alexander? Okay, my boy Nick Alexander. Time for you to come up to Clemson, get some coffee. Thank y'all, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to our Fiveable Cram session. Okay, so we've got APUSH in a couple days. We're going to eat this wheat, get this grain, obtain the grain, right? Get this bread, whatever y'all want to write on that. Remember, just a fun thing that we can get into here. Just to amuse ourselves when we are writing the DBQ or the LEQ, just write, let's get this bread and just cross it out. Okay. Right. Let's get this bread and cross it out and you're good. Okay. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, die for the rye. Okay. That's another one. Y'all are doing some really good stuff here. So let's go ahead and figure some things out. We want to go ahead and start answering questions. Now, remember, if you're in here, you want to, go ahead and upvote questions. Okay. So consider, going in and giving a question an upvote if it's a question that you're like, hey, I have that same question too. Now, remember that in the turn, yeah, grab this gluten. All right. So in the chat, do not ask people to upvote your question. Let the market decide that. Okay. Let that just happen on its own. So oh gosh. Okay. So we've got a lot of recent stuff here. So with that, okay, good. I see some Henry Clay there and some stuff some questions I actually want to answer. All right. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and note Reagan's presidency and or policies. Okay. First of all, you would want to note, Reaganomics, okay? Reaganomics, which is based on the idea of low taxes stimulating the economy, okay? Low taxes. Now, also, Reagan sought to cut government spending and didn't really succeed in doing that because Reagan, he ran conservatives. They wanted lower taxes. They wanted to cut government spending, but they also wanted an increase in military spending. And so Reagan was able to get the tax cuts he wanted, but he increased military spending and was unable to get his cuts in domestic spending passed through Congress. And so the result of this was an increased deficit. Yes, Reaganomics was referred to by its opponents as trickle-down economics, okay? That basically that Reagan was cutting taxes for the rich and expecting it, that it would just trickle down. When you can think about a trickle, it's like drip, 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 that kind of thing, right? And so as far as that Reagan, was a staunch anti-communist. Now, that's another thing, with the military spending, he wanted to challenge the Soviet Union, that he went forward with a rollback policy. Okay, so Reagan had a rollback policy when it came to communism, not just a containment policy. That Reagan said if there are anti-communist guerrillas in communist countries, such as, especially if they're in the Western, in our hemisphere, in the Americas, in Latin America in particular, then we will help those people. And so that's what Reagan wanted to do. Now, that's the Iran-Contra affair that the Reagan administration illegally sold arms to the Iranians so that they could help the Contras in Nicaragua, these anti-communist guerrillas. Now, as far as that goes, they did that without the consent of Congress, but at the same time, kind of looking back on that, is there anything wrong with fighting communism? So, of course, it was kind of off the books. It was a bit of a scandal. But then Reagan was known as the Teflon president, okay? The Teflon president, because things didn't really tend to stick to him. Like the Iran-Contra scandal was a scandal. Now, it was part of his second term as well. Typically, second terms are a little rockier than first terms, okay? Caleb's here. Caleb's, yes, hydration is definitely essential, especially if you're using your voice like all day, okay? So I've been broadcasting or teaching since 9 o'clock this morning. And so you want to understand that, yes, Reagan, the Iran-Contra scandal rollback, okay? Now, the other thing is, how did Reagan come to power in the first place? That, how is it that the conservatives went from being defeated in 1964, handily defeated in 1964, to winning in 1980. So if we look from 1964 to 1980, for example, here, let me go ahead and let's see. Let's go in here and 1964 presidential election, just to kind of show you what's going on here. That in 1964, now let me go ahead and share my screen with you. 1964 presidential election. So when we look here, Barry Goldwater got trounced, okay? Barry Goldwater got his home state of Arizona, plus a handful of states in the Deep South. Goldwater had a message of limited government. He wanted to limit the power of the federal government, severely limit it. And of course, that message rang well with Southern whites in the 1960s who were looking for a more hands-off federal policy because Lyndon Johnson was an advocate of federal civil rights legislation. And so Goldwater got trounced in the Electoral College, also got trounced in the popular vote. 38.5%. This is one of the most humiliating defeats that a candidate has ever experienced. Now, Lyndon Johnson's campaign deployed the Daisy ad or the Daisy spot, which had this little girl. Okay, so the Daisy spot, which had this little girl who was counting flower petals, and then all of a sudden there is a nuclear explosion. And so what happened here is the message, now it never even said anything about Goldwater. It just said, you know, it had this girl and all of a sudden this nuclear countdown and explosion. And at the end it said, please vote for President Johnson. You know, the stakes are too high for you not to. And we must all learn to love each other or we must die or something. I mean, it was just this ad that had a very powerful impression. It only aired one time and it had that powerful of impression. So Goldwater was soundly defeated. Now, the irony here is that it was Johnson who got us into, who got us into the Vietnam War. And so with that, Reagan supported Goldwater. Okay, so Reagan supported Goldwater in 1964. He gave, which kind of in some ways may have kind of overshadowed Goldwater, because the most famous speech of, which conservatives called this the speech that Ronald Reagan in 1964 gave this speech called A Time for Choosing. And so that's where Ronald Reagan was really becoming really the spokesperson for this rising conservative movement. So 16 years later, Ronald Reagan's going to be elected president in an overwhelming victory. Okay, so if we look at the 1980 presidential election, we see that really the tables have turned. That Reagan defeated Carter. He's got a very large victory here. And then in 1984, Reagan had a 49 state victory, okay, over Walter Mondale with, again, 58.8% versus 40.6. So what is it about 1964 versus 1984 which has made conservatism fashionable? Now, there are a few things here that would be useful to note here, and let me pull something up, because I think y'all are wanting to pass things around. Let's see. So if I were going to do a peer, let's see. Okay. Copy of APUSH period 9 notes. Okay. Now the so-called period 9. Okay. Now I don't like to use numbered periods, but when in Rome, I went ahead and named this that. And so I've got a document that I'll go ahead and share with y'all that I think I've shared with some people at a previous Fiveable session where I go into some of the things about the rise of the conservative movement. That in the 1960s, you had the high watermark of American liberalism, but then remember that was followed up by the Vietnam War. It was followed up by Watergate. It was also followed up by a great deal of economic stagnation. So you had the OPEC oil crisis. Then you had inflation and unemployment. And so when Ronald Reagan took office, when he gave his first inaugural address, he said that in this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. And so there was great, that's basically the only one like that I've got. Okay. So just be satisfied with what I'm handing you and we'll go from there. So with that, one of these days, maybe I'll have something more comprehensive, but right now, yeah. Oof. All right. So maybe we got to a good time to hit the whoa. All right. So we got to hit the whoa. I got to have a little more sass in it. Somebody told me. So All right. So that sort of thing. I'm hitting the woe. Later on, we'll talk about the Treaty of Woe. All right. So with that, what should we know about the Clinton era? What we want to note, Megan, is that the post 1980 is estimated to be only about 5% of exam content. And so when it comes down to it, like typically, my APUSH class this year, we got through World War II, we're introducing the Cold War, and that's about as far as we're going to get. And so from that, that's something that that when we think about 5% of the exam, it's okay. That if you've gotten through World War II and maybe at least introduced the Cold War, you've got a lot of stuff that you need. But yeah, don't get too deep into the weeds, about the Clinton era, because most of what I've seen has concerned Reagan. So when you think about 5% total from 1980 on, and that's nearly 40 years, that we're talking about 1.25% per decade. But I think also it tends to be weighted in the 1980s and early 1990s. So that's good. Yeah, World War Woe. I like this. Austin, I like you. The Treaty of Woe probably ended World War Woe. That's great. I like that. The Treaty of Woe ended World War Woe. All right. So who was involved in the Populist Party? What did they advocate for? So Carla, let's note that. So let me go into into the Populist and get that going for you. So the Populist Party, let's see, go into the Gilded Age here. And let's see, agrarian movements and populism. All right. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, let's go into the Populist. All right. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you, and I'm going to show you a little bit of stuff about the Populist Party. Yeah, that's Noah. I agree with you. Don't be concerned about predictions. I never try to predict the DBQ or the LEQ. That's just not something. I think it's counterproductive. You're trying to game the exam. Just be prepared for whatever they throw you. So the People's Party, or the Populist, was organized in the 1890s, and this was made up of Southern and Western farmers. This was what was known as a third party. Anytime we're talking about a party that is not the Democratic Party, it's not the Republican Party, this is what's known as a third party. So we're talking about when somebody's a third party candidate, they're running from outside the Democratic or Republican Party. Now, the Populist platform, there are political reform proposals and economic reform proposals, some of which are taken up by the progressives in the era following this, some of which are not. Now, first of all, direct election of senators. The political reform proposals were all based on democracy, direct election of senators, ballot initiatives, and the secret ballot. Whereas economic reform proposals, a graduated or progressive income tax, unlimited coinage of silver or bimetallism, and nationalization of the railroads. Now, the railroads were never nationalized. The unlimited coinage of silver never happened. The progressive income tax was taken up by the progressives in the early 20th century. And so the political proposals, some states picked up on the ballot initiatives. Direct election of senators became part of the Constitution with the 17th Amendment during the Wilson administration. And then, of course, the secret ballot is now in use all over the United States. All right. So with that, let me just send a message real quick. I need some more warm water. All right. So with that, political and economic reform. Now, was it a Jeffersonian movement? It involved farmers. So in that sense, Jefferson might have sympathized with the farmers. But when we look at the call for higher taxes, we think about, the nationalization or the government takeover of the railroads. All right, the government take over the railroads, that they want the railroads to be owned and operated by the government. And so when we look at this, they wanted more government. So that's something that this movement, it was farmers, advocating for some democratic reforms, but they also wanted an expansion of government, which is why the progressives picked up some of these policies. And so why bimetallism? There was a problem with the money supply. Okay, so going from that, when the money supply was not a lot, and if you have money, it's okay to have a short money supply because you have money, it's more valuable. But when you don't have money, it can be a problem. Now, the gold standard, this was something that the advantage of the gold standard is you have sound money, that there's not a lot of inflation. Your money has a store of value, and there's not a great deal of inflation. And so when we think about it today, like when we think about the dollar, the value of the dollar in just nominal dollars versus 100 years ago, you have to multiply like by 20. Okay. So if we think about like $1,000 in $50, if somebody had $50 in 1915, it's kind of like having $1,000 now. Okay. That's kind of mind blowing. With the gold standard, money will keep its value. Money will keep its value. So the populists wanted bimetallism. All right. So they're wanting bimetallism, which is two metals. They're wanting free coinage of silver to get off the gold standard, to also have money that's backed by silver. Now, remember that today our money is backed by nothing except for the government's guarantee. That's it. It is only the government's guarantee. But back then, you could take your money to the to the bank, and you could get gold back for it. Now, remember, you're taking a $20 bill, and that's kind of like taking $400 to the bank. Okay, so you could get gold for it. It was backed by gold. And so with that, the populists wanted two forms of currency in a 16-to-1 ratio. Now, the populists in 1892, they ran their own candidate. And then notice that they're not able to break the solid South. Okay, the Democratic Party between Reconstruction and World War II had a hold on the South, on the former Confederacy and the former slave states in general, that was rarely broken. Okay, rarely broken. And so the populists got a few electoral votes. They got about 9% of the popular vote. So that's the other issue, that a lot of the states that they're winning are states where people don't actually live. And so 1892 didn't go so well for them. Now, the Panic of 1893, that added some momentum to the populist movement, because when the economy is bad, people are more likely to listen to populism. Now, remember that populism generically is any movement that speaks to the masses, okay? Any movement that is a mass movement rather than a movement that speaks to the elites. So an anti-elite movement. And so the election of 1896 put up William Jennings Bryan versus William McKinley. And William Jennings Bryan gave his Cross of Gold speech at the 1896 Democratic Convention. And so he is speaking against the protective tariff. If protection has slain its thousands, the gold standard has slain its tens of thousands. And then from there, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor, this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold, William Jennings Bryan says here. And of course, this is an anti-Bryan cartoon that is painting Bryan as, somebody who is sacrilegious, whose election is going to lead to anarchy. Now, the populists endorsed Bryan. That's one thing. Well, thank you, populists. Very cool. But at the same time, do you necessarily want the votes of the populist, okay? Or do you want their public support? Because a lot of people felt that the populists were, a dangerous lot. And so, this really in some ways is good to have their endorsement, but in some ways not so much, because he's associated with these people who are viewed as extreme. And so with that, Bryan went on a whistle-stop tour campaigning through the Midwest, a little bit New England, the South, but those states were largely, how they're going to vote. And McKinley at the same time ran a front porch campaign, which was very well financed. And so Bryan, was defeated in this election. And so you see where Bryan got the populist stronghold of the of the West, and then got the South. Okay, got the solid South for the most part. Every former Confederate state backing Bryan, but then we see that his all of his whistle-stop touring of the Midwest didn't end up going so well for him there. And so, he loses the Midwest and the Northeast. So with that, we see that the populist movement is pretty much put to rest. In 1900, there was a rematch, and excuse me, you see that he lost. Let's see. So Brian, let's see what's going. So he lost a little bit of ground in the West, but gained Kentucky. So with that, both of them kind of close calls in the popular vote, but that's pretty much the end of populism. I've got some hiccups going on. Sorry about that. All right. So as far as that, Carla, hopefully I helped you out a little bit with that. All right. So we're figuring out. Okay. So let's see. I don't want to go. I'm sorry. Wait, what are they talking about? Okay. So Andrew, I don't get the joke, but I'm sure it's funny. All right. So we've got a question about, my goodness, I've been talking all day. I need to make sure I'm saving my voice. Okay, so all right. So as far as that, hydration break, not so. Oh, did somebody say, whoa? All right. So with that, okay, yes, John Denham sent me the legend from Illinois. Wait, is it Illinois? It's not in, or he's in Indiana, but from Illinois. Is that what this is? Okay. So as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, oh my goodness. Oh my goodness, Paul. Sending us to PewDiePie. You got me. I tell you, I'm going to be watching some PewDiePie on Friday night once these exams are over, I can tell you. So what are the most important New Deal programs to know? Now, that's really up to you. You want some illustrative examples. Now, it's not necessarily profitable for you just to try to know all of the New Deal programs. But when we think about the New Deal overall objectives of relief, recovery, and reform. Now, first of all, I would note the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Okay, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, I would say, is very important. That is something that is, because it's addressing what's going on with the lack of confidence in the banks. In his first inaugural address, FDR said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And so part of the problem with the Depression is that people were panicking. Okay. So as far as, no, this is warm water in my thermos here, which is, keeping me from losing my voice. So the most important New Deal programs, the FDIC is addressing some of the panic that is associated with the banking industry. Thank you so much, Caroline. Whoa. Okay. So if you can let me give you my thermos here. All right, so if you can refill that with some warm water, that would be great. Love you so much. Love you too, Daddy. All right, so I've got a fresh supply of warm water, and if y'all are able to find a bag of my cough drops, that would be helpful too, or any kind of hard candy, really, that'll get, thank you so much. Okay, so. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I tell you what, if you're going to talk 8 or 9 hours a day, you got to take care of yourself. All right. No. I'm here. All right. So the FDIC, it's addressing the lack of confidence that people have, that they were running on the banks, okay? They were making runs on the banks because what would happen is you hear that the bank is running out of money. And when you hear that the bank is running out of money, you're just like, oh my goodness, the bank's running out of money. I'd better go and get my money out right now. So everybody makes a run on the bank at the same time. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because as they're running on the bank, of course, the bank doesn't have all of that money at one time. Okay. The bank doesn't have all that money on one time. And so that run on the bank shuts the bank down. And maybe if there hadn't been the bank run, that wouldn't have happened. And so FDR, the first thing that he does when he takes office is he declares a bank holiday. And so the banks are closed for a week. And when they open back up, FDR has the first of his fireside chats. Okay, so the fireside chats here, these are basically not that he's giving a speech, he's putting himself in your living room. Okay, so FDR is putting himself in your living room and talking to you one-on-one as your president. Okay, so FDR is there in your living room talking to you one-on-one. So with that, we're dealing with, a different kind of president. That part of the New Deal is FDR showing that I care about you. But see, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, if the bank goes under, then I still, even if the bank goes under, I still have my my money because the government's going to give me my money. So the bank agrees to some type of federal oversight and regulation, and they have to pay for membership in the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And as a result, I know that my money is safe in that bank up to $250,000 per institution. And so with that, that addresses the lack of confidence. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And so with that, which really doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but when you look at it that way, yeah, all right. So you look at it that way, that's that's the principle there. Now, another one I like is the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, the FDIC addresses reform of institutions to try to stabilize the economy. Now, the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, that's one thing that I really like, just because I like to go to parks and stuff like that. And so the CCC would get young men and put them in these camps, like they're literally living in tents, and they're doing work on state and national parks. And the young men who were involved in the CCC camps, they would get a little bit of money for themselves, but most of the money they were earning was going to their families. And so the CCC and the PWA, the Public Works Administration, these were two what we would call shovel-ready projects, Keynesian economics, that these shovel-ready projects that are going to be that are going to help kind of prime the pump. That John Maynard Keynes, said that when the economy's bad, then you should have people doing public works and building infrastructure and that sort of thing. All right, so with that, ladies and gentlemen, that is the CCC. Now, another one might be the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which the Tennessee Valley was a rural, impoverished area in the South. I've read recently a book about Reconstruction, where the thesis here of this book is that Reconstruction didn't end in 1877, that Reconstruction didn't end until the New Deal and World War II. And when you think about it, it wasn't really until after World War II that people living like that the South is seen as about as prosperous as the rest of the country. Okay, I live in the South, and I don't have any trouble getting by over here. I think it's a great place to live. But when you think about that time between Reconstruction and World War II, the South really wasn't that great of a place to live. There was a great deal of poverty in the South. And, the poverty wasn't restricted to any one racial group or anything like that. So as far as that goes, that would be the Tennessee Valley Authority, that these people lived in the Tennessee Valley. They were poor. It was rural. This is a place where companies, like private companies, weren't necessarily like chomping at the bit to provide electricity for people in this area. So FDR provides these federal public utilities for the impoverished Tennessee Valley. And so as far as that goes, all right, y'all are about to get some food there. So thank you, Emma. Hopefully that helps you a little bit. All right. So with that, okay, so Tinley, we've got the first party system, the first two-party system, which began in the 1790s with Jefferson versus Hamilton, the first two-party system. And that goes through the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is the demise of the Federalist Party. Now, that's partly because Federalists who'd participated in the Hartford Convention, after Andrew Jackson's big victory after Andrew Jackson's big victory in the Battle of New Orleans. All right, we've got Nick Alexander. I understand that one, the Tiger Rag. So as far as that goes, let's go back to the first party system. So after the War of 1812, the first party system dissolves. And what you have is the era of good feeling, or the era of good feelings, depending on whether you want to put an S at the end of it. Doesn't really matter. So with that, we see that we have kind of a one-party system where the Republican Party is the only party. The Jeffersonian or Democratic Republican Party, however you choose to refer to it, is the only political party. But in the course of that, they have absorbed some ideas from the Hamiltonian plan. So, Jesse, I'm going to get to the American system now. That after the War of 1812, Henry Clay proposes the American system. NIP, okay? National Bank, internal improvements, protective tariff, okay? So National Bank, internal improvements, protective tariff. Or we could say NIPD, okay? Because we could think in terms of National Bank, internal improvements, protective tariff, DAB, okay? That would be another thing that we could do here, okay? So as far as that goes, yeah, dab on them graders, okay? So with that, National Bank, internal improvements, protective tariff, DAB, all right? That's what Henry Clay wanted. Now, when you think about this, a national bank, internal improvements, protective tariff, that sounds a lot more like Hamilton than Jefferson. And so we have some tension here, okay? During this era of good feelings, there are still people who disagree about how much should government do. And so the second party system, where we've got the Whigs and the Democrats, Henry Clay's Whigs versus Jackson's Democrats, we have this disagreement that people have, like, should government be involved? Like, should there be a national bank? Should the federal government be financing internal improvements? And should we have a high tariff a high protective tariff in order to promote the development of industry in the context of the market revolution? Or should we have a low tariff, which is best for the interests of agriculture, which agriculture still controlled the economy? I mean, agriculture still made up a great part of the United States economy during that time. And so with that, all right. Yeah. So as far as that goes, is it Kanye? Are we getting into, are we getting into history there with let me see if this is Kanye. Let's see. Okay, highlighting bushes. The video. So Noah, when did you send that video? Okay. So, oh my goodness. Oh, wow. I love it. I love it. Kanye needs to be on the APUS history exam. Can we all agree on that? That Kanye needs to be on this exam. No question in my mind. This exam, Kanye is the hero that we need and deserve. Is he not? Okay, so with that, ladies and gentlemen, wow, that is great. I am loving it. All right. So what political party was Henry Clay affiliated with? I tell you, that's basically, if we think about the so-called period 9, George Bush doesn't care about black people. That's basically what you need about the 2000s, right? So we have reviewed that decade. Okay, we reviewed the decade of the 2000s. All right, covered John Denham. All right, that's part of the so-called period 9, right? What party was Henry Clay affiliated with? The Whig Party. Okay, so the Whig Party and the Democratic Party, that's the second two-party system. And so Henry Clay's leading the Whig Party, which was more nationalistic, okay, whereas Jackson's party was much more Jeffersonian in terms of states' rights, okay? So Henry Clay, more democratic, whereas, Henry Clay, more nationalistic, Jackson, more states' rights. Henry Clay, more loose constructionist, Jackson's Democrats, more strict constructionist. Henry Clay's Whigs in favor of the American system, and then Jackson's Democrats opposed to the American system. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, going into, where we get into the changing political parties. So the Whig Party ceased to exist in the 1850s in the aftermath of the the 1852 loss. They lost very big in the Electoral College, not very big in the electoral vote, but in 1852, the Whigs got crushed in the Electoral College. And then the Kansas-Nebraska Act divided Northern and Southern Whigs. Okay, so the Kansas-Nebraska Act was kind of the last nail in the coffin for the Whig Party. And when we think about the causes of the Civil War, one of the causes of the Civil War, you can get into the demise of the second two-party system, because that's something that, with the demise of the second two-party system, we see that there was political instability and upheaval. Okay, there was political, instability and upheaval, which is something that Civil War kind of starts there. It's no accident that the Civil War started when there was a time where it wasn't, it just things weren't very stable, because when the parties have legitimacy, then you're going to see more support there, and less likely that there's going to be a civil war. Okay, so as far as that goes, we want to, get into the next thing. Okay, so can I discuss Republicans and Democrats post Cold War era? All right, so what's going on here? Okay, so Ryan, I think that what we see is that in World War II. I think a good way to go through this, Ryan, would be for me to go through like election by election. Okay, how does that sound to you? All right. So as far as that goes, we can get, let's see. Sounds good. Okay. So let's go ahead. If it sounds good to y'all, what I'm going to do is we're going to go through the presidential elections after World War II. Okay. So let's go back to 1948. Okay. So the context of the 1948 presidential election, that Harry Truman. Now, before this, if we go back to 1944, we see that the South is always supporting the Democratic Party. Okay, 1940, we see that FDR is carrying the South, and if we go back further. FDR was doing very well in 1936. By 1940, people are starting to say, FDR, this New Deal thing, it's not working quite as well as you thought it would. Because remember that in the New Deal, there was not a quick economic recovery that happened in the New Deal. And so with that, we go back, when we go back to the 1920s, so going back to like the 1924 presidential election, you see this phenomenon of the solid South. The rest of the country is in a Republican mood. The South is supporting the Democratic Party. And here you see all of the states of which Oklahoma technically was a Confederate territory, because the tribes that were living there supported the Confederacy. And so when you see this, that the former Confederacy was voting one way and the rest of the country's voting another. And so then in 1928, that was kind of an interesting time here, because the Democrats, now, first of all, Republican, Calvin Coolidge Prosperity, that had been a very good time for the country economically. And so what happens here is, notice that there's the Coolidge Prosperity, but there's also that Al Smith, the Democratic nominee, was a Catholic. Now, this was during the heyday of the Ku Klux Klan and anti-Catholic prejudice. Notice that the states that stayed loyal to the Democratic Party, they're in this election, are going to be some of the same states that 20 years later they start to rebel. Okay, so as far as that goes, in 1948, what had happened was Harry Truman was running for re-election, and he integrated the armed forces. He signed an executive order integrating the armed forces. Also, the Democratic Party, for the first time in 1948, adopted a civil rights platform. So the Democratic Party had, for a long time, even back to the antebellum period, had relied on the white South, okay, as really its bread and butter. And so what we see here are some of these states from the Deep South that they revolted, and they supported Strom Thurmond, who was the governor of South Carolina and the candidate for what was called the quote-unquote States' Rights Democratic Party, or the Dixiecrats. And so this is the first rift that we see there, when the South does not support. There are some southern states that are rebelling against Truman's reelection. And then as we go into the 50s, like Ike, we see that the South is still, largely. Now, of course, Ike, a lot of people like Ike. So that's something that has to be taken into consideration there. But you can see that, the only states that are not voting for Ike, the only states that don't like Ike, are states that were were at one point, slave states, there in the South. And so when we look at 1956, Dwight D. Eisenhower, looks like he never lost an electoral vote from a former free state. And so, but then again, people in Texas and Tennessee, Louisiana, California is not part of the South, but Florida, there are people that like Ike. Okay. So remember, Ike ran a very personality driven campaign, Ike didn't so much run a party-driven campaign. It wasn't like vote Republican, vote Ike. I like Ike. Okay, that's what they said here. Now, when Kennedy ran in 1960, you see a couple of states that weren't going to vote for this New Englander that may be in support of civil rights. But now notice here that some stuff's up for grabs, that Nixon actually won a few southern states. And so things are starting to get a little bit confusing. Now, in 64, what happens is that the Democratic Party nominated Lyndon Johnson. Now, then we see that some of the states from the Deep South backed Goldwater because he was talking about a more limited role for the federal government. And this was a time when there was a lot of, the federal government was starting to lean on the southern states. This is 10 years after Brown v. Board. And so this is what happens in 64. Now, 68, what we have here is that George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, ran as part of the American, Independence Party, which was, again, a party that was advocating law and order, a smaller federal government that doesn't pursue a civil rights agenda, and staunchly anti-communist, of course, being in the 1960s and being conservative. Now, 1972, now Nixon was elected here. Now, notice some southern states voted for Wallace, but notice that South Carolina voted for Nixon. I think this is the first time that South Carolina is voting Republican since Reconstruction. Okay, so my home state of South Carolina, Nick Alexander's home state of Florida, and as well as a few other southern states are voting for the Republican. Now, in 1972, what we see here is Nixon's Southern strategy, and it worked, okay? That Nixon, in his first term, intentionally catered to Southern conservatives. Now, I would not necessarily cast Nixon as a conservative per se, but he was somebody who was catering to Southern conservatives. And so Nixon was catering to these folks and you see here, every southern state. He got a 49 state victory here. And so from that, this is where we're starting to see the Republican Party. I mean, the Republican Party swept the South. And the Democratic Party at this time was starting to move to the left. George McGovern was seen, was cast by Nixon's campaign as a leftist. Now, of course, this is the other thing. The irony of the Watergate scandal is that the Watergate scandal was the least necessary scandal ever to happen. Okay, that Nixon's people, the committee to reelect the president, they didn't have to do what they did. Okay, so as far as that goes, it was completely unnecessary. And so 1976, now look what happened here. The Democrats nominated Jimmy Carter, who was he was a Southern governor. He was seen as a moderate. He was somebody, even today, Jimmy Carter is really more of a moderate Democrat. Like personally, like Jimmy Carter has always remained pro-life. It's like throughout his life, he has always been pro-life. He has never been a supporter of abortion rights. And so with that, that's one thing that he's actually, criticized the Democratic Party. So very similar to what the Democrats will do in the 1990s, that Bill Clinton was somebody that was seen as more of a centrist Democrat. Now, the economy went bad, though, and in 1980, Ronald Reagan, running on a very conservative platform of a limited federal government, that we see here that's Reagan almost sweeps the South here. Okay, so Reagan defeats Carter in what looks like a 45 state victory. And then 1984, when the Democrats, nominate Walter Mondale, we see that, we've got a 49 state victory for Reagan. Now, then, again, that 1988, the Republicans are, they're taking advantage of being able to characterize their Democratic opponents as, quote unquote, tax and spend Democrats. Now, you notice here that throughout the with 1980, 84, and 88, that the South is very strongly supporting, Reagan and Bush never lost, besides, if we look at 1980, Jimmy Carter won his home state. But you can see here that besides Jimmy Carter winning his home state in 1980, that Reagan and Bush never lost a former Confederate state. So by this time, the Republican Party is becoming like the established party in the South. Now, then the Democrats, they turn around and nominate Bill Clinton and Al Gore. So this was a ticket of two white Southerners who were known at the time as moderates in their party. And so you can see here some mixed results here, but Clinton did carry several of these states, several Southern states, and the same thing in 1996 that Bill Clinton carried again several Southern states, even though Bob Dole seems to have done a little bit better in the South and in the heartland over here. So with that, that's really Bill Clinton is the last Democrat to really experience any meaningful success in the South. Okay, so when you look at 2000, George W. Bush, once again, you see that the South has returned to the Republican Party, and so that is a whole transition that you've seen here as a result of the civil rights controversies, and that the Republican Party has become like the place for people who have a more conservative mindset, and that wasn't always the case. Okay, that today people who are more like liberal or progressive tend to be Democrats, whereas people who are more conservative tend to identify as Republicans. Okay, so Tom, can you answer my question after Tom, please? Okay. I'm going right now by upvotes. Now, one thing that I would note here, Ethan, is I've got a video on the APUSH DBQ. I've got a 3-part video. Okay, so I've got a 3-part video on the APUSH DBQ that I would recommend on YouTube. Okay, so that's what I would recommend for anybody looking for help with the DBQ to look at my video that I've got available on YouTube. Okay, and so as far as that goes, now Richard, I don't see your question here, but let's see, is it one of those? Like I'd have to scroll down a bit. Let's see, Richard, I'm trying to find it. But I'm going to have to go with the questions that are getting some upvotes. So note, what are the key events we should know about during the progressive era? Okay, so as far as the progressive era, we want to know like the major argument here. Okay, that this is something that we are, that the government is responding to what are seen as like the excesses of the Gilded Age. Okay, so in the Gilded Age was defined by government support for big business. And so you can see that evidenced by the Pacific Railroad Acts with the subsidies, the Great Railroad Strike, Pullman Strike, both of those strikes, which were put down by the federal government getting on the side of big business. Okay. And so with the progressive era, you get into government regulation of business. So that's the main thing. That remember that the government during the Gilded Age was not laissez-faire. Sometimes the government during the Gilded Age is characterized as laissez-faire. Nothing could be further from the truth, okay? So when you look at this, that you go from, because the popular outcry was not that government's not doing anything, but that government's always taking the side of big business. And so the progressive era, the main thing you want to understand is that there is a more expansive role seen for government in the economy with the Meat Inspection Act, the FDA, and also now notice with the coal strike, instead of putting down the strike as previous presidents have done and siding with business against labor, Teddy Roosevelt invited leaders of both sides to come over to the White House and let's talk about this. This is part of Teddy Roosevelt's square deal, that he mediated the settlement. And remember, the Clayton Antitrust Act was much stronger than the Sherman Antitrust Act. And so that is something that we see here, that the Clayton Antitrust Act was stronger. and specifically exempted labor unions. Okay, so those would be, I mean, you can of course get deeper. I've got a video on my YouTube channel about the progressive era amendments that I would suggest that you watch. But just a quick live explanation, I think that'll work. All right, how did the Great Society build upon the ideas in the New Deal? The Great Society represented another expansion of government, okay? So first of all, new social programs such as Social Security and, never mind. Social Security was New Deal. Medicare and Medicaid. These are, you have government basically providing health insurance for the elderly and for people who cannot afford health care. Okay, so those are building on that. Now, another thing, what we might note if we're comparing the Great Society with the New Deal is that FDR never challenged the system of segregation that existed in the South. FDR was a clever politician, and he wanted to hold the New Deal coalition together. So although now note that FDR did, offer some New Deal programs. Okay, so there were some New Deal programs, like there were black CCC camps, the Tuskegee Airmen. This was part of, the pilots were trained at the Tuskegee Institute, which was set up by Booker T. Washington. They were trained over there. And there was money from FDR's administration that went into that. Okay, there was money from FDR that went into that. So with that, the Great Society built upon the ideas of the New Deal in some ways, by creating more social programs, but also the Great Society was also about racial equality, which was not really something that FDR really dabbled in. All right. What should you know about the market revolution? So the market revolution is happening. The market revolution is happening, at the beginning of the antebellum period, like in the wake of the War of 1812. Now, somebody might have mentioned Gibbons versus Ogden. Okay. Gibbons versus Ogden. And Gibbons versus Ogden was a case about steamships, okay? So steamboats and the cotton gin, there are things happening here that you're starting to see new technologies, that transportation is becoming more efficient. We're seeing the building of more roads and turnpikes and canals. So the market revolution is that the United States economy, at least, in some parts of the country, is starting to industrialize, that technology is advancing. So it's almost like kind of a precursor to what you're going to see with the full-scale industrialization after the Civil War. And so with the market revolution in Gibbons versus Ogden, like the state of New York tried to give a monopoly to Robert Fulton's steamship company. And Cornelius Vanderbilt was running a steamship line between New York and New Jersey. And the Supreme Court defined what Vanderbilt was doing as interstate commerce. And so therefore it could not be regulated by the state of New York. And with that, that's something that you want to note, that the Supreme Court, the Marshall Court, was supporting business development. So we start to see the development of market capitalism, of these forms of business that are not based on land like agriculture, but they're based on raising capital. Like if you have a steamship company, it's not just one person. You start a corporation with a lot of investors, and so that's what's going on with the market revolution. All right. Migration patterns. Okay. So first of all, I would note Irish immigration. Okay. Irish immigration during the antebellum period. The Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s in response to Chinese immigration. Now, note, they waited until the railroads were built. They waited until they didn't need the cheap labor anymore, and the Chinese were excluded. Now, another one you want to know about the new immigrants, the so-called new immigrants during the new immigrants at the turn of the 20th century. So when you're looking at the new immigrants, that is a phenomenon that we're seeing in terms of Italian Americans, Greek Americans, people coming from from Russia, and so there are things there that are happening with that. Okay, so the new immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, that was during the Progressive Era. And so that's what we're dealing with the new immigrants. And then you want to note the great migration of African Americans during and after World War I. Okay. And that is really the first time that we're going to see. This is really the first time that we're going to see like Black people in large numbers outside of the South. Okay, so that's something that you want to keep in mind there. And the response, to the Great Migration in the North was not very friendly. Okay, there were race riots that happened in the North as a response to that. Okay, so you want to understand that that's going on. That's going on as well. Okay, so going from there, we want to those would be the main ones that I would focus on as far as migration patterns. And so all the parties over time know what they stood for. Charles, I would know the first party system, the second party system. I would note the conflicts between Democrats and Republicans on the tariff when we get to the Gilded Age, and then I wouldn't worry about that as much until you get to post World War II. And civil rights and that sort of thing. Okay, so that's something that you would want to note there. All right. So with that, that's what I would say as far as knowing the different parties. Okay, so with that, let's think about Megan. We'll talk about, let's save your question on the civil rights movement for the next session. Okay, John C. Calhoun, we would associate him, of course, with nullification, the nullification crisis. That's something that would be important there. Okay, so the nullification crisis would be an important development. Also, Calhoun was one of the foremost people that was responsible for the positive defense of slavery. Okay, so the positive defense of slavery that we started to see in response to abolitionism. Okay, so in response to abolitionism, you started to see the positive defense of slavery, where Southerners are like, that's one thing about Southerners that you want to note, that when you tell me I'm wrong as a Southerner, I become more right. Okay, so if you tell me I'm wrong, I become more right. And so with that, that's something that's kind of a response to the abolitionist movement in the 1830s. That's like, oh, slavery is wrong. Well, if you would have told like Jefferson or Washington slavery was immoral, they're like, yeah, we're not really comfortable with it. But once northern abolitionists start calling for its abolitionists and start calling slaveholders evil, then people change. Okay, as far as their Southerners start to get defensive. Okay, everything is racist. Okay, so as far as that, the nullification crisis, that's something we can talk about tomorrow. So ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our session for tonight. All of you are 5able Plus members, so you can certainly come back tomorrow at 9 o'clock for another cram session. All right, so I'm going to be glad to lead that. And remember, y'all, get the bread, eat the wheat, all of that good stuff. And I will see y'all tomorrow evening at 9 p.m. Eastern. It is always a pleasure.